Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Uh, Looking forward to having you all trickle in, and we'll get started in just a moment here. Thank you so much for joining. Again, good morning, everybody. We're really looking forward to today, and we'll get started in just a moment here. While we're waiting to get started, would love if you all just went ahead and introduced yourselves in the chat if you'd like. It's great to see everybody. Chat's over there on the right-hand side, I think. Right-hand side? I have a different screen, but I Amazing. Welcome, welcome. Go ahead and please introduce yourself in the chat. We'll get started in just a moment. Good morning. Oh, I love it. Calling in from DC, calling in from London, Istanbul. Would love if everybody would shout out their what part of the world they're in right now. All right. We'll go ahead and get started, folks. First of all, I just want to say good morning, afternoon, evening uh, to all of you, no matter what part of the world you're in. Last year, we had folks participate in our forum from 69 different countries. So I'm hoping that we have just as global of a turnout this year. Um, and first and foremost, happy World Tourism Day. This is our favorite day of the year here at CREST. And on behalf of our whole CREST, or Center for Responsible Travel team, we just want to say thank you and welcome. So I'm going to get into sort of what the theme is today, and then introduce our keynote speaker. But before I do, I just have a few quick remarks. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Wesley Espinosa. I'm the interim executive director here at the Center for Responsible Travel, or CREST. We're really excited to be putting on an incredible forum. And as we start the day, I also want to give a special thank you to my colleague, Alex Collins, our Director of Marketing and Communications, who has done an incredible job putting together just a slew of thought leaders from around the world to engage in an incredible dialogue today. So we're really excited today to be in this virtual space that spans continents and crosses borders. And we're so excited to share this World Tourism Day Forum with our global community. I truly cannot think of a better way for CREST to celebrate its 20th anniversary than being here with all of you, engaging in dialogue, learning from one another, thinking outside of the box, and working towards a future in travel and tourism that's more collaborative, more intentional, and genuinely responsible. On that note, I just want to say a special thank you to our sponsor, Holbrook Travel, a travel company whose mission is to provide a true connection between travelers and nature and the people of destinations. We're really appreciative of their support and backing to make today a reality. So, what is today? What's today and tomorrow, and what is our theme at our World Tourism Day Forum? This year's theme, 20 years of tourism, looking back and beyond, isn't just a celebration of our past. It's a roadmap for the future. We're going to dive deep into trends, engage in policy discussions, and explore collaborations. Looking back 20 years, CREST was founded as the Center for Ecotourism and Sustainable Development by Dr. Martha Honey and Dr. Bill Durham. Here we are today with an organization that has worked around the globe producing research, thought leadership, impactful projects, building alliances, and creating spaces like this for conversation amongst tourism practitioners, policymakers, thought leaders, and travelers. In our 20th year, I'm so excited to tell you all that CREST has a new mission and vision that have been revamped. And I say a new mission and vision before I get into them. I just want to say that we want to build on the legacy of the last 20 years and make the future look brighter. And that last 20 years for us revolves around one word, and that one word is center. We see ourselves as a center, as a place where people, just like you all, can gather to learn, to teach, to engage, to discuss, to create projects. We look at ourselves as a center, a place from which we can pivot and facilitate ideas to different parts of the world to support destinations and support communities. A center is a place that is full of life. It's where people gather in towns and cities. And we're so excited to continue being that center role for this travel and tourism community. So on that note, I'll just share our new mission and vision real quick. And our new mission is quite simply to be a center of tourism knowledge, empowerment, and action for destination communities with a vision of a world where travel benefits communities and the environment. On that note, I really just want to say again, thank you so much to all of you for being here today. And I ask you just for today and tomorrow, as you participate in this forum, to latch on to a couple of our values so that you can think like CREST as we look back and ahead. Our values as an organization are, we believe that travel is important and that it can positively impact destinations. We believe that justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion have to drive conversations and work. We believe in collaboration, partnership, and dialogue more than competition. We make decisions after examining evidence and listening to multiple perspectives. We want to take a holistic approach to tourism that focuses on the natural, cultural, spiritual, and sacred elements that make places and destinations incredible to visit. And finally, we want to remind you all that destinations and communities are at the core of what we define as responsible travel. Without those destinations and communities, we cannot truly have responsible travel and tourism. So thank you all so much. Again, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. And on that note, I'm delighted to introduce our first keynote speaker. I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Joseph M. He's Professor of Sustainable Tourism at Western Sydney University in Australia. He's also co-chair for the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on the future of sustainable tourism. And he'll be delivering an incredible keynote today titled Greening Tourism, Harmonizing Social, Ecological, and Economic Exigencies. Thank you so much, Dr. Chair, for being here, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Wesley. You did well with that last word. Hi, everyone. As Wesley said, my name's Joseph. I'm currently in Sydney. That photograph you see as my background, it's not actually midday. It's just after midnight here in Sydney. So I say to you a very good morning. I will share my slides now, if I may, to get started. I have 20 minutes. So Wesley or Alex, please intervene if you can't hear me or if something technical fails to happen as it should. So again, thank you all. And I see some familiar names. I'd also like to make special mention to Martha Honey, who's here in somewhere, I believe. Your 1999 book, Ecotourism and Sustainable Development: Who Owns Paradise, was one of my favorite books as a student back then. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and to all the distinguished guests, those who I know and those who I might not know, it's nice to meet you here. So let's get started. As usual here in Australia, it's customary for us to make an acknowledgement of country to the traditional owners of the land on which we work. So for me, with respect for Aboriginal cultural protocol, and out of recognition that I work on campuses that occupy traditional lands, I acknowledge the Darug, the Eora, the Darawal, and the Wiradjuri peoples, and thank them for their support for our work and for having us on their lands. So as today is World Tourism Day, I thought I should align with the United Nations World Tourism Organization's theme, Tourism and Green Investments. And the title of my presentation, Greening Tourism, Harmonizing Social, Ecological and Economic Exigencies, I employ very tentatively because of the tendency for the term greening to be associated with greenwashing and other types of convenient conceptualizations. As well as in my talk, what I will also feature, and perhaps you might find it interesting, the images I use on a number of my slides are AI-generated images. The first one you see there is an AI-generated image with the word tourism as the search word. So you can see there, the backdrop is rather mixed. There's a futuristic background as well as a foreground that looks rather like today. So my talk will focus on four key areas. I thought if the theme was 20 years looking back, looking forward, I thought it might be a good idea to have a quick run through key global events that have shaped global tourism. I will also look at the last 20 years of tourism geographies research, as insofar as looking back. And in looking forward, I will pose the question about how do we bridge the research practice gap and where to from here in terms of looking at the horizons for tourism in the future. So the last 20 years, I thought I would extend it a little bit to 2000. And as you can see, as I've said there, since the early 2000s, the timeline with specific relevance to global tourism is one framed by crises: technological advancement, geopolitical wrangling, and a planet and its inhabitants, human and non-human, facing a looming existential reckoning. The AI-generated image you see there came about from me just typing the word over tourism. As you can see, it looks remarkably like Venice in the middle there, and then all around it are all of those artificially generated images of what over tourism might look like. So what did the last 20 years look like, and what were some of the key developments? If I have a quick run through, 2000, we had Y2K. Of course, many of us would remember at that time there were fears of planes falling from the sky, servers crashing, and so on. But of course, none of that happened. Then we had the Sydney Olympics. The World Trade Center attacks, I guess, is one of the bookends in the last 2 decades. In 2002, the Euro was launched, which has had significant impact on tourism in Europe. The Bali bombings in this part of the world where I am was quite significant for travel. And crises loom large in the timeline over the last 20 years, the Iraq War. Then we saw these technological advancements that have had a considerable impact on tourism. Facebook was launched, the Athens Olympics as well in 2004. Further crises, both man-made and natural hazards, London bombings, Hurricane Katrina. Twitter was launched in 2006. The first iPhone was launched in 2007, and the fourth IPCC report was released in 2007, and it warned that the cost of reducing emissions would be far less than the damage they will cause. And I guess as a rhetorical question, I ask, have we really heeded that warning from over 15 years ago? And in 2007-8, we also had the global financial crisis. And for some countries, especially countries like Japan, where I was living in for the last 5 years, coming to terms with the global financial crisis is still a long-term and ongoing thing. You can see the AI-generated image there was in response to the word global warming. It's rather dystopian with people floating around in housing on the water. So as we head towards the second decade of this century, we had earthquake in Italy, bombings in Jakarta. Instagram was launched in 2010. Who would have thought that Instagram is over 13 years old now, and Instagram has had a significant impact on global tourism. In Japan, there was the earthquake and tsunami in 2011, as well as the Fukushima reactor disaster, London Olympics and the Costa Concordia cruise ship, which has not had a long-term impact on the desire for cruising, the Boston Marathon bombing, Ebola in 2014. clearly showing that we've had experience of these kinds of large-scale viral outbreaks before. Paris bombings in 2015, the Zika virus, Rio Olympics, and Brexit, which has a considerable impact on British tourism as well. And as we head towards the last few years to where we are today, we see once again crises generated by political process and geopolitical events. And of course, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, but most important, which we are still coming to terms with, arguably. But in 2021, the IPCC report, sixth major IPCC report, warns that catastrophic outcomes cannot be ruled out. The Glasgow conference spurred pledges to restrict emissions, but not enough to avoid dangerous climate change. And that leads us into 2023, where we saw these wildfires in Greece, Italy, and Hawaii. And for us here in Australia, we're awaiting summer with some trepidation. Okay, so the key takeaways from looking at the last 20 years, looking back at the last 20 years, is that external shocks are an inherent feature of global tourism, and how we deal with that is going to be critical to moving forward. Mega events such as the Olympics, the Paris Olympics is coming up very shortly, can help stimulate international travel. And we saw that recently in Australia with the FIFA Women's World Cup that has stimulated tourism arrivals to the country. We also see that the IPCC reports and everything within them have had little impact on stemming global tourism flows. What that says is open for a larger discussion. And we also see that geopolitical shocks continue to have an impact on tourism, but they, for the most part, they tend to have a temporary dampening effect rather than a long-running impact. What's also important that if we look back not just at the last 20 years, but at the last 100 years, but the last 20 years in particular, since 2000, we can see that the 10 warmest years in the historical record have all occurred since 2010. And we see that about 11 billion metric tons of carbon are added to the atmosphere each year. Because that is more carbon than natural processes can remove, atmospheric carbon dioxide increases each year. What does that mean for all of us that have an interest in tourism, but also seeing tourism be sustainable in the long run? So with that said, from looking at that timeline going back to events that have shaped global tourism, what I want to do now is draw on 20 years of tourism geographies research, and I do this because as the editor of the journal Tourism Geographies, I have some insight into just what we've developed over the last 20 years. But I also wanted to say that there are 29 articles in this collection, and they're all available for free download. There are no paywalls, so if anybody wants to get hold of them, please do. So as part of my going back into the research archives and trying to find out what researchers have been saying over the last 2 decades, I've picked out several key themes, about 9 themes and 9 papers around which I will base the last part of this talk. So in 1999, around the time that CREST was established, I'm guessing, Alan Williams and Armando Montanari raised the issue of self-regulation. And they said that self-regulation is rooted in neoliberal beliefs that individual decision-making based on self-interest is the most effective means of achieving predetermined goals, including consumer satisfaction. In the case of sustainable tourism, this involves an assumption that individual decision-makers are able to assess and act in the interests of both their long-term and their short-term goals. This immediately makes me think of over-tourism and tourism problems in places like Bali, where self-regulation clearly is not working. And given the conflicting interests in the development of tourism and the existence of external social costs and benefits, it's no surprise that there's considerable cynicism as to the capacity for effective self-regulation. We see this happening in Venice, right? Not knowing which way to go. Is €5 going to be enough to stem the crowds that keep pouring into the destination? Importantly, Alan Williams and Armando Montanari say that policy implementation is very much a socio-political process, a bargaining exercise, meshing political and social acceptability with economic and technical feasibility and with administrative reality. So when it comes to sustainable tourism, there are trade-offs being made all the time. So with that said, when we talk about self-regulation, I move on to how scholars have criticized tourism as part of this neoliberal global capitalist expansion. And I draw on the work of Robert Fletcher in my next slide, as you can see there. Fletcher says that tourism's dramatic growth over the past half century as a function of capitalist expansion, whereby the world capitalist system seems to overcome the inherent contradictions that may threaten its long-term survival through various spatial, temporal, and environmental fixes. He says that tourism's remarkable success may be due in part to its vital function in sustaining capitalism, and thus that contemporary discussions of sustainable tourism may belie an underlying concern for this former function as well. He draws on ecotourism as a specific angle for his discourse, and he says that growth in ecotourism specifically can be understood as an innovation of tourism development strategy in the face of problems associated with mass tourism development. He also quotes Martha Honey, or at least draws on what Martha Honey said when she says that tourism does more harm than good to people and societies of the third world. Of course, that's a wider discussion, but Fletcher argues that the capitalist world system comprises a coherent transnational capitalist class with a common interest in perpetuating the system from which they benefit by promoting global economic growth based on the cultural ideology of consumerism. And when we come back to some of the challenges we are facing in tourism today, those words of Fletcher, of Robert Fletcher, echo very much when it comes to discussions about over-tourism as an example. Taking Fletcher's critique about capitalism further, I want to draw on the work of Rosalind Duffy, who talks about nature-based tourism and the intersection with sustainable tourism development. Duffy says that tourism, including nature-based tourism, simultaneously produces and conceals the contradictions of capitalism. This is because it relies on creating attractions or new sources of accumulation from the very crises it produces. Nature-based tourism is promoted as a win-win that can resolve the contradiction between continual economic growth and finite natural resources. And Duffy argues that in using a tourism lens, we can better understand how capitalism produces and then conceals crises by reconfiguring them into new sources of accumulation. In some work I'm doing with Mary Mostafanejad at the University of Hawaii at the moment, we are looking at the fires on Lahaina and asking ourselves these very questions. And as Duffy also says, tourism is identified as a core component of the green economy. We see this in the UNWTO's theme for tourism this year. And Duffy says this refers to a shift to economic activities that are apparently also ecologically beneficial. She says that it is via mechanisms of pricing, regulation, and appropriation that promoters of tourism claim to offer an environmental fix for capitalism. But of course, she's critical of this and says that linkage with the green economy is merely the latest iteration of a very old debate centered on sustainable use on the one hand and making nature pay its way on the other. Notions of natural capital and the idea that tourism can provide a win-win solution to tensions between economic development and sustainability. I imagine the very things that were discussed in that book by Martha Honey in 1999, Ecotourism and Sustainable Development. So from Duffy's perception of the commons, and I move on to this idea of the human and nature nexus. And I draw on the work of Jaakko Saarinen, who talks about wilderness environments. And he says that they are generally considered to represent the last parts of true and original nature, untouched by civilization and modernization. And in most cases, this is no longer true. Wilderness environments have been explored and increasingly converted into administrative management units in conservation policies and protected area networks. He's very critical of this and saying in wilderness areas, raw materials are increasingly extracted for non-local consumption, often by non-local actors. And he draws 4 key conclusions: that wilderness is a social construction, the way we understand it, has deep manifestations in our individual and collective practices towards wilderness and its utilization, whether it be extractive or not. Secondly, he says the different understandings of wilderness have conflicting and symbiotic relations with each other. Neoliberal conservation combines conservative and touristic notions of wilderness, creating new conservation in inverted commas, and implying that protecting nature requires valuing it in terms that people and even corporations care about. Otherwise, what is the point, right? He says. So So in moving from the capitalist critique as well as the idea of wilderness and human in nature, I want to move on to this idea of inclusive tourism that Regina Shavens raised in 2016 to 2018, where she says that inclusive tourism is a concern with inclusiveness that enables analytical links to be made between the ambitions of global policymaking and a range of grassroots initiatives. These involve different actors in diverse settings seeking to widen the range of people involved in producing tourism, consuming tourism, and benefiting from tourism. And indeed, when we talk about tourism going wrong in different places and where people are protesting against it, it comes about because the consumption, the production, and the benefits that derive from tourism are not are evading the people who put tourism together in the first place. Shavens talks about inclusive tourism as focused on ethical production and consumption as key components of the idea. And in social terms, inclusion invites two sets of critical questions that at a destination level we should ask. Who is included? And by that very notion, who is excluded? And the second question is, on what terms are they included? Particularly if we're thinking about tourism as a tool for development in low and middle income countries. Moving on to the next theme, we've gone from inclusive tourism to the next one, which is particularly important right now in the shadow of the pandemic, on labor geographies and decent work. We see across the globe that there is a labor force crisis in tourism and hospitality, and across the whole visitor economy. And from this research that Dimitri Ioannidis and Christina Zompoukas have done, they argue that for decades, policymakers have celebrated the employment creation potential of tourism. But, they say, such positive rhetoric has done little to quash the criticism by observers who dismiss tourism-related jobs as bad ones, that are easy to obtain but also easy to lose, are poorly paid, and cater to lowly skilled individuals, many of whom are female and commonly are immigrants from the global south. They also ask a number of questions. Who are these workers and where do they come from? What kind of experiences and skills do they have? What motivates them to enter the labor market? And what decisions and other actions do they then make to remain in the sector? These questions resound in the present because we see here in Australia and in other countries around the world, while we want tourism to reach the heights of 2019 and to regenerate and regrow, finding a labor force that can provide the services that are required by tourists is increasingly difficult. So the bottom line, they say, is that this low status afforded to labor in the tourism and hospitality field ties directly to the growing casualization of work internationally. And we see this in the tourism industry, and we see this especially in the gig economy. Moving on to my own work, where I investigated the idea of modern slavery in tourism, because very often, while modern slavery practices in the global textiles, mining, agricultural, domestic services, and sex industries have been on the end of much critical research and mainstream commentary, the global tourism supply chain, as I say on the slide, has not faced the same extent of investigation and critique. And modern slavery itself, when we think about it, refers to practices and institutions that undermine, restrict, or extinguish human freedoms and exploit human assets through legal and illegal means. And we see colleagues around the world doing research on this now and shedding the light on this practice of modern slavery in tourism. That tourism is inherently labor intensive, provides ideal conditions for human exploitation. So the call to unveil all of these aspects of tourism production and consumption that are tied to modern slavery are intensifying, and for good reason. And if indeed tourism is one of the globe's most pervasive industries and is a fundamental pillar for development, acknowledging and scrutinizing modern slavery remains an under-acknowledged and pressing line of thought. So one would think that this critical stance I'm taking is somewhat pessimistic, right? And you would be right in saying that, because for us as researchers, what we try to do is get to the bottom of the stickier aspects of tourism, which are more difficult to deal with. And one of the stickier aspects I bring up now, and we see this in in the shadow of COVID-19. The rise of tourism enclaves, and a lot of times these tend to be attached to digital nomads. And when we talk about tourism enclaves, Jaakko Saarinen says that despite its locally problematic nature, enclave tourism seems to have many desirable characteristics for the global tourism industry and for organizing the value chain optimally for revenue creation with minimal spillover to the local community, especially where foreign owned environments are the case. We see this very much in package tourism, and we see this now, particularly where global nomads occupy these enclaves with very little to do with the communities in which they are situated. Tourism enclaves, most importantly, are linked to social dumping, and by that, I refer to where the practice where multinational companies originating from high-wage countries search for ways to avoid legal constraints and introduce social dumping at lower levels of the production chain. In my research in the Pacific, we refer to this as asking tourists to pay first world prices while paying local residents third world wages. These tourism enclaves are seen as spaces that provide minimal opportunities for host-guest interaction, which widens the gap between the host communities and the visitors. And these enclavic tourism spaces are regarded as having weak linkages, very weak linkages, with the surrounding economy, a situation that often leads to high economic leakages and low levels of local employment and salaries. So if we look forward to the next 20 years of tourism, we ask ourselves, how can these things be continuing to proliferate when they are problematic in plain sight? One of the last themes that I will draw on is that this idea of human flourishing, which I've been writing about and have more writings to come. Human flourishing is more nuanced than the everyday idea of simply meaning to thrive. Human flourishing suggests a deep shift in values, and that the old ways of thinking no longer works. We saw this as we were drifting through COVID-19, right? What would the new normal look like? Was the question that resounded. And if tourism is considered an extractive industry, how does the mining of people in place result in effects that leave the hosts in more favorable positions and therefore flourishing? To what extent can flourishing influence the demand side of tourism, yet maintain a viable balance between purpose and profitability? And as I say there in the last line, the practice-based approaches to human flourishing in tourism talk of decoupling of growth-oriented policies, talk of the multiple prescriptions from degrowth, tourism degrowth, that is, enhancement of community engagement and agency, preservation of sense of place that is constantly changing as the uniformity of destinations becomes more common, and the elevating of the worth of nature and the wider non-human world, as well as, and I note that Wes mentioned this word in the new philosophy for CREST, the acknowledgement of spirituality and conscious consumption and production are things that we so far have heard very little of when we hear about tourism planning and development. So with that said, I get to the third and second last part of my talk, and this is getting towards the end. So thanks, Alex and Wes. If I'm gone over time, please forgive me. This idea of bridging the research practice gap. For me as a researcher, as well as a practitioner and consultant, I'm constantly grappling with this idea of how does the research that we do meet the practice? How do we talk to practitioners? And how do practitioners work with us to address some of the more sticky problems that we see in global tourism? So with one sentence, I say this. I say that advocacy, activism, and critique on their own, without consideration of pragmatic solutions, holds limited potential for transformative change. What are the trade-offs? And are trade-offs always going to be necessary in order for us to meet an equilibrium that the entire stakeholder group is going to be happy with? Finally, to close the presentation, I asked this very question, along with the theme of looking back 20 years and looking forward. What are the horizons for tourism that we have to look forward to? And you can see that AI-generated image is rather dystopian of the word horizon. I asked three questions. Can the decarbonization of tourism safeguard tourism livelihoods? I say this because while we know that the enormous growth of tourism is not sustainable in the long run, how can we deal with this, but at the same time safeguard tourism livelihoods, especially for communities in low to middle income countries that rely on tourism. My second question, and these are rhetorical questions, how can tourism degrowth address global equity and justice concerns? We hear around the world of this push towards tourism degrowth. But when we think about degrowth on one hand, it also, on the other hand, it also talks about reduced income. It also talks about probably fewer jobs. And the question is, if we speak to our colleagues in low and middle income countries and we say degrowth, many of them will say to us, and they have said to me, we don't want degrowth. We want the same standard of living that people in developed countries have. And my final question before I finish is, how can the greening of tourism rise above the grand rhetoric and hand-wringing? And we see a lot of that, right, today on World Tourism Day with the theme of greening tourism. There's all of this grand rhetoric on one hand and a lot of hand-wringing on the other. But how can the greening of tourism rise above all of this and offer genuinely practical solutions? Before I finish to say thank you, I was reading El País, the Spanish English language newspaper online today, and an important quote jumped out, which I thought is worth sharing. The journalist said in their critique of tourism, a changing climate will affect how and when tourists travel. Yet this causation runs the other way as well. Tourism is itself affecting the climate. So with that, I say thank you and hand back to you, Wes or Alex.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. Again, that was Dr. Joseph M. Thank you so much for taking the time to put together that keynote speech. Really incredible insights, and we greatly, greatly appreciate your support. On that note, we are so excited to go to our first panel here. And for our first panel, I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Christine Buzinde. And Christine, please let me know if I said your name incorrectly, and please do correct me. She is the professor and director of the School of Community Resources and Development at Arizona State University. And Christine will be moderating an incredible panel today, and I will pass it on over to her so that she can introduce our incredible panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're connecting from, and happy World Tourism Day. Again, my name is Christine Buzinde. I am here at Arizona State University, joining you from Phoenix, Arizona. I am pleased today to be part of this CREST World Tourism Day Forum, and even more pleased to be joined by a fabulous group of panelists who will be sharing with us today various elements connected to tourism. The panel this morning or this afternoon, this evening, again, depending on where you're joining us from, will be focusing on things that have happened within our industry over the last 2 decades. We'll also be focusing on lessons learned over the past 2 decades that we could use to promote more responsible forms of tourism moving forward. Without further ado, I'd like to bring the great group of panelists before you. I want to start with Dr. Martha Honey. Dr. Honey, if you could please introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, hi, good morning or good day. It's lovely to be with you all, and I'm really honored to be part of this 20-year celebration of CREST and of World Tourism Day. I'll talk a little bit more about my background in my answer to the first question, but I was one of the co-founder of CREST and worked there for 16 years. And I now live in Rhinebeck, New York.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Honey. If we may proceed with Mr. Masaru Takayama, please.
Hello, good evening. My name is Masaru Takayama. I'm based in Japan, and I'm very happy to see Martha again after a few years. It's good to see you, really.
You too.
Yes, thank you. It leaves only 20 minutes for us in Japan for the Tourism Day, but happy World Tourism Day, everyone. I'm representing Asian Ecotourism Network today, and of course, I was with Martha in regards to ecotourism. We were at the International Ecotourism Society back then. It's been almost 20 years, I suppose, all coming together now. It's exciting to talk about what's had happened in the last 20 years, and so So yeah, that is about me. So I'm being working with the certification bodies and which might be relevant in the later talks that I'll be speaking about. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mr. Edward Hall.
Yes, good day. I'm Edward Hall. I'm the former tourism coordinator of the Bureau of Indian Affairs here in the United States, and worked with over 574 federally recognized tribes, Native Hawaiian communities, and of course, other tribal communities that are currently not recognized. I helped establish the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association and the American Indian Tourism Conference, recognizing the needs of Indigenous peoples here in the United States to build their capacity to engage in this industry. And I also worked with the federal government to recognize tribes as a part of our national fabric and how we present our country to the world, and to recognize that we have nations within this country that need to be heard independently and not to homogenize them. And also now I am currently retired from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and working independently, but appointed to the George Washington University as the Indigenous Economic Development and Tourism Executive in Residence for their School of Business and the International Institute of Tourism Studies. Thank you.
Thank you all. You're all key thought leaders in your respective areas. It's an honor for us to spend a few moments with you here today and learn a little bit about our collective journey as an industry, a tourism industry. I'd like to begin with the first question, which allows us to focus on this notion of the supply and demand side of tourism and things that have manifested over the last two decades. So as you reflect on the demand and supply side of tourism, in your opinion, how has it evolved over the last 2 decades? And also, let us know any specific examples that you think the audience would be able to relate to as you describe this. And if I may, Mr. Hall, if you could start us off.
Thank you. Yeah, there's been tremendous change in the last 20 years I've been able to see as it regards Indigenous peoples of the United States. I mean, that's been where I've been mainly focused, but I know that we funded a pavilion at ITB Berlin for Indigenous presentation as part of the American Pavilion, Discover America Pavilion, and experienced really the process of being discovered once again by the world. I think that the world had seen Indigenous peoples in the United States as being largely extinct. And so part of our process in approaching tourism has been using tourism as a tool to reestablish Indigenous peoples here as being not only a part of society, but relevant to society, and then having their own place and not being defined by the industry or the other voices that have largely been the only voice that through which we've been heard. So tourism has provided the tribes now an opportunity to define their own narrative, to be in control of their own industry. And it's up to us now in this process to provide the tools and resources to be effective and to look at infrastructure in its broadest context so that we're supporting these nations in building their human workforce at the highest level of governance down to the business development side, but more importantly, as a means of maintaining and identifying their culture as a core component of how they utilize that part of themselves to define how they're a part of this industry. And then at the same time, use this industry as a means of protecting that culture and that resource for themselves.
Wonderful. Thank you for those insights. It really is quite interesting to learn about ways in which engagement in tourism can further create awareness. And I loved your comment on identity affirmation as relates to the indigenous groups. That's great to hear. Mr. Takayama, from the other part of the pond, what insights might you add to this question?
Yes. Well, 20 years ago, I was just thinking, what it was like to travel back then. I guess we were relying on the information that was, I think we had very limited resource on the tourism products, and we were relying more on travel agencies to book things. I think we were just beginning to emerge of the digital era. So I think I was using text emails, but not like big photos like that. And a lot of time we had to send in the fax, fax machines, and making the reconfirmation for airlines. And all the things had to happen. We had to apply for visa and make a long line to get issued. And so traveling was a bit of a hassle that time, I have to say. And the security information was not really available, so you weren't too sure until you really get there. The logistics also. So I think the part of fun was actually to travel, not knowing what to expect. That was a part of the travel, and so that has drastically changed because now you can really get all this information in your hands. So all these things are really happening to change, and I think on the especially the younger generation, Z or whatever you call it, not because of the SDGs, younger people are really understanding what sustainable development goals are. And so these people are going to be eventually the mainstream of the travelers. But at the same time, like us, our generation is really not understanding what exactly SDGs are about. So I think we are really changing the entire paradigm of the people who are actually traveling. So the emergence of online travel agents and how to book, the information availability, all these things are really changed. And also after the COVID, in particular, people are looking into more remote places, and people traveling for wellness and healings and things like that. More of a spiritual experiences, more I think emergent in every corner of the world. So I think in compared to 20 years ago, people are actually going to every corner of the earth now because of the information availability. So that's probably the biggest change I see.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, you're right in that technology has both liberated, but to some extent, one could also argue enslaved us in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, so true. So true.
Dr. Honey.
Yes, thank you so much, Christine. And following up on Ed and Masaru's remarks, I wanted to focus on what I see as the growth in the supply of responsible travel over the last 2 years. In fact, the process really began going back to probably the last 2 decades of the 20th century, to like the late 1970s, early 1980s, when there began to be early experiments in ecotourism. And at that time, ecotourism included small-scale nature-based tourism in pristine parts of the world, often near national parks and other types of protected areas. And these were also oftentimes areas that were homes of poor rural and indigenous communities and native communities. For instance, the International Ecotourism Society was founded in 1990 in Kenya, where it focused on the conflictive issues between rural people, particularly the Maasai, and national parks. In Costa Rica, which by the 1990s was considered a global leader in ecotourism, its eco-lodges were concentrated around the country's outstanding national parks and protected areas, and not along its beaches. In fact, ecotourism was not at that point a sun and sand type of tourism. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen a tremendous expansion in what is considered ecotourism or sustainable tourism. The supply has grown exponentially. What began to happen is that the principles and good practices that were honed through experiments in ecotourism began to be applied to mainstream sectors of the industry, beach resorts, urban hotels, other parts of the industry such as tour operators, car rental companies, golf courses, ski resorts, convention centers, etc. Also, ecotourism and sustainable tourism began to expand their offerings. Food and cuisine became increasingly important. Organic, slow food, local cuisine, farm to table became the hallmarks of sustainable tourism. So too, we saw changes in terms of health, wellness, and fitness, including yoga, massage, exercise, and adventure into ecotourism or sustainable tourism activities. We also saw the growth of experiential tourism, learning while traveling, be it languages, cooking, rock climbing, windsurfing, etc. And along with that came voluntourism and other forms of visitor contribution to local communities. So all of these ideas help to enrich and expand what is meant by responsible travel. So to sum up, in recent decades, we've seen a tremendous growth in what is defined as responsible travel. We've moved from ecotourism focused on small-scale nature-based travel to sustainable tourism, which seeks to apply the principles and good practices of ecotourism to all types of tourism. And at the same time, we've seen a growth in what is included in the package of sustainable or ecotourism, and a lot of innovation which incorporates new components into responsible travel: food and cuisine, health and wellness, green and sense of place architecture, voluntourism, and other community give back initiatives. The result is that today the quality, quantity, and variety of responsible travel offerings is far larger than it was just a couple of decades ago. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Honey. And it's really quite interesting to reflect back on the expansion of the concept and the ways in which different within our industry have co-opted this and adapted it in ways that make sense to them. But I think what is also, given that we're talking about supply and demand, on the demand side, ways in which consumers have utilized this concept to inform their decision making, in terms of where they go and how they decide between multiple options that are there. This is certainly promising as we continue to build on this notion of sustainable tourism, but also sustainability writ large. So thank you all for your comments on the notion of how things have changed in terms of the supply and demand side. We're all aware of the fact that tourism often takes place within communities that might be receptive or not so receptive to tourism development within their locales. And so from that perspective, I'd like to ask a subsequent question connected to stakeholder engagement and community input. What are your respective experiences with regards to stakeholder and community input? And specifically, given that this is a vital aspect of the tourism equation, how do you think this has changed over the last 2 decades? And if I may, I'd like to start with Mr. Takayama, please.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess maybe because we are in ecotourism, sustainable tourism, I think we are more limited to think about, why are you involved in tourism at the first place? And we're always thinking with the community, because lots of ecotourism is community-based, of course, nature-based in Asia and Pacific. So that we often think about what's in it for them. If we implement tourism, because tourism should be a part of responsible activities where it has to bring benefits to the community. However, in reality, not tourism is responsible, and a lot of developments are taking place without permission or without proper process to be embraced by the community. So I think all this development has been always going on, regardless of time. However, because of the emergence of social media, I think the lag of the time in particular, the communities are responding to what's really happening on the ground. We are able to see what's, wherever you are, it's, within your palms, that what's going on is really a broadcast. Anybody can be a reporter nowadays. So seeing what's happening, and so I think the people are really making a change in the way that they are also able to really convince other people to make that tourism project to be more responsible, and also that benefits the community. So I think those things are really emerging, and it's very helpful in a way. But at the same time, I think the greenwashing is still a big problem, because the way they broadcast be really censored depending on who it is, and we really don't know who they are really, who are broadcasting. So we really need to be smart in the sense that in a way it's really coming from what is this source is secure and reliable. So those things are things that we need to be considering when you talk about the community.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Takayama. Yeah, because I mean, we rely on technology to get information out to various stakeholders, but we also have to be cautious about ways in which, we consume that knowledge that comes up, because it could be information that is contrary to the messages that we want communities and consumers to have in that respect. So thank you for shedding light on that component of technology yet again. If we may proceed to Dr. Honey, please, thoughts that you might share on this topic.
Sure, thanks. So in terms of community input and engagement, I thought that I would talk about one area where CREST has played over the decades a significant role, and that's the area of travelers' philanthropy, or what is now known as impact travel. The first international conference that CREST ever held was at Stanford University in 2003, and it was on travelers' philanthropy. We brought together, as I recall, 40 to 50 people from companies involved in travelers' philanthropy, that is, tourism businesses that in one way or another were supporting community projects, such as local schools, libraries, orphanages, health clinics, tree planting, beach cleanups, and so on. And we identified early on that there were three forms of giving, what we called time, talent, or treasure: financial donations, material goods, or volunteers. At the time, there was no organized campaign to promote travelers' philanthropy, no standards for how it should be done, and no studies on how effective it was. And in most cases, tourism businesses were making contributions but not soliciting donations from their guests, the travelers. I recall the owner of one high-end and very highly respected East African safari company explaining at our Stanford conference that his company was making corporate donations to AIDS orphanages, but they were not asking their guests to help because they thought that their guests were only interested in seeing wildlife. However, over the coming years, this company gradually began to invite their guests to make contributions to help children whose parents had died of AIDS. And they found that, in fact, many of their guests were eager to help, and that many said that the learning about AIDS and meeting some of those involved in AIDS work was a highlight, in some cases, the highlight of their trip. This company went on to develop a robust giving program to which the company, as well as many, perhaps most of their guests, their travelers contributed. After our initial conference at Stanford, CREST over the following 2 decades, worked together with travel businesses and community organizations to help to strengthen the concept of travelers' philanthropy. We recognize that philanthropy or giving can be done badly, and it can cause divisions within the communities and have other negative effects. We published a booklet entitled The Do's and Don'ts of Travel Giving. We also made a documentary film about travelers' philanthropy, organized other conferences, published handbooks, conducted surveys and studies, did field projects, and worked with businesses to develop their own programs. At an international conference in Costa Rica, we launched the concept of destination-wide travelers' philanthropy. That is, bringing together businesses within a travel destination to collectively raise donations from tourists and tourism businesses to support local projects. Out of this came two organizations which we at CREST are particularly proud of. One is Care for the Cape and Islands in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and the other is the Monteverde Community Fund in Costa Rica. Both of these remain active and vibrant today, raising funds from tourism and a range of other types of businesses to support community projects. There's much more that can be said about travelers' philanthropy, or as it was renamed in 2020, impact travel, but a couple of important conclusions. Today, the idea that travel businesses and travelers should contribute to community projects is generally considered part of responsible travel. Many, perhaps even a majority of travel businesses are involved in supporting even worthwhile projects in travel destinations. And travelers say they look for companies that work with projects in the host communities. So travelers' philanthropy, impact travel, has definitely over the past 2 decades put down deep roots and has become a vital part of the responsible tourism equation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for those remarks. I could not help but think about the fact unforeseen circumstances. So in this case, we have to think of the ethics of philanthropy and ways in which companies are actually paying attention to those components. Thank you for your insights on that, Dr. Honey. Mr. Hall.
Yes, thank you. When we talk about stakeholder engagement and community input, we also have to talk about the terms of engagement. And that's really important for Indigenous communities. We are looking at an industry that is, ages old, with a dominant culture defining the terms and terminology. We're working with Indigenous cultures that are looking at the fragility of that, the fact that they are the destination, and so that culture is something that is put on the line as a commercial product. And so in the exchange, how do they then have the tools and resources to not only engage with the industry in relation to the protection and vulnerability of their cultures, but how are they able to establish the framework within themselves first to define their own terms and then work back with the industry and define their rules of engagement, and also to protect their intellectual and cultural property in the exchange. And so I think these are really important things that we've looked at in regard to how we have developed some of our training and technical assistance to tribal communities. But I look at our work here now as having to really gather the tools to provide tribes the framework to now use all of these new resources of media, right? To look at this as tourism as also being a resource of education to the broader consumer, and to be able to then inform consumers before they arrive, and also as they're making their decision, so they are better consumers, that we are actually getting a positive exchange at the front end rather than having to educate them on the ground when they arrive. And the first step really is to work with our communities in establishing their internal protocols so that they have defined themselves how they want to present and exchange, who they are and what they have to offer. And by doing so, then they can establish protocols for the consumer. And largely we find that the first people to break a protocol it's internal. So, it's really important then that the communities define their terms of engagement. I look at, when we have a global industry now, we can use this as a means of educating the world in terms of the care and respect for our antiquities, for our, the sell and exchange of things that were taken from us. And I think that it's also when they come to our communities, how they respect what we have to offer. We've had a long struggle here to move ourselves beyond the idea of being primitive and to being able to be part of the broader society and actually have art rather than just crafts. So, I think as we're able to move forward in this industry, we are setting the stage for Indigenous communities to have that environment where their voices are heard and respected, but also when you come to their home, you understand then the importance and relevance, not just of their people, but their environment, their ecosystems. And I think that this will set the stage then for a better environment for them now to have a better role in maintaining and conserving the environment that's so central to their cultures.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, for those remarks, and to the rest of the panelists. Your remarks remind me of the fact that sometimes communities, particularly communities of the margin, tend to look at tourism as the panacea, right, to their economic, social, and environmental goals. And from that vantage point, they often feel as though they don't have the leverage to negotiate and be the architects of tourism, so to speak, and create their own terms of engagement, as you rightfully mentioned. Yet we're actually, I think, one of the things that we could look back to over the last 2 decades is that we see many Indigenous communities that have actually developed codes of conduct, right, that allow tourists to learn about what to do and not to do before they arrive at the destination, ways in which to respectfully and responsibly engage in tourism that moves beyond the hedonistic aspect to one in which they're actually genuinely learning about the community, but also learning about themselves in that process. But this all begs the question, the education component is central, and I know Dr. Honey mentioned this, but also so did Mr. Takayama. The challenge with all of that comes when we do not sometimes, tourists in particular, do not distinguish between the wealth of information they're getting online, what is accurate and what is not, and so communities could create all sorts of codes of conduct and talk about ways in which they want tourists to engage, but if there's misinformation out there, that also sometimes can counter those very laudable efforts that communities have engaged in. So these are great remarks you've all shared, and I feel as though we don't necessarily have enough time to delve deeper into these rich topics that you have shared with us. But I do hope that our audience will be tickled enough intellectually to go read more about this from both practitioners as well as academicians who have written about these components. So if we could move on to our subsequent questions. In the discussions that we've had earlier, many of you have talked about directly as well as indirectly challenges that communities, nations, and regions have faced as they deal with tourism. To the best of your knowledge and reflecting on a solutions-based approach, please reflect on a specific challenge that the industry has dealt with over the last 2 decades, and speak about how this challenge has been resolved, particularly the partners that have aided that remedying of the challenge. And as we proceed with this, Dr. Honey, if you could start us off, please.
Sure. Thank you, Christine. So the challenge that I'd like to discuss is how concretely to measure the social, economic, and environmental impacts of tourism, how to determine how much harm or good tourism businesses are doing. Put another way, how to ensure that the claims of responsible travel are not simply greenwashing, and that tourism is doing no or little harm, and may even, in some cases, be helping to regenerate and improve a destination. Early in my tourism career, I came to believe that certification programs for ecotourism and sustainable tourism were a vital tool in this effort. In fact, over 2 decades ago, in 2000, the year 2000, I had the privilege of organizing the first ever international conference on ecotourism and sustainable tourism certification programs. We held it at Mohonk Mountain House outside New York City and invited some 40-odd participants from around the globe who had built or were in the process of building green tourism certification programs. This conference produced the Mohonk Agreement, which outlined the key components that we believe needed to be included in any effective eco-certification system. In the decade following this conference, a lot of work went on in creating tourism certification programs to measure the triple bottom line. Much of it was spearheaded by Ronald Zanabria and Rainforest Alliance. Many of the eco-certification programs were nationally based in, for instance, European countries or beyond, Australia, Kenya, South Africa, Ecuador, Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, one of the early adopters of the Certification for Sustainable Tourism, or CST program, was Karen Lewis, owner of La Barrios Eco Lodge. La Barrios became the country's first accommodation to earn CST's highest score, 5 green leaves. La Barrios was carefully studied, and its findings revealed that not only did the CST certification help improve the efficiency of the resort's operations and quality of its surface, but it also had positive spillover effects on the staff and surrounding community. Retention increased because staff took pride in working for a well-run and sustainable eco-lodge, and staff took the good practices home with them. Studies found that many local families took up recycling, composting, tree planting, and organic gardening, utilizing skills that they had learned at La Barrios. Then in 2010, tourism certification took a great leap forward with the creation of the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, or GSTC, designed to set standards and promote certification programs to tourism businesses and destinations around the world. While the GSTC has never had sufficient funding, staff, or industry buy-in, it has become a vital instrument in setting standards and expanding certification and accreditation programs. We, as responsible tourism proponents, would be far weaker without this global institution. So in conclusion, I want to raise up eco-certification as both a solution to the challenge of how to measure impacts of tourism, while at the same time recognizing that much work remains to be done to ensure that certification programs are truly effective tools for ensuring sustainability. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Honey, for leading with that element of certification programs in connection to education, which I think is vital at all levels of this industry as we think about it. Mr. Hall.
Yes. One of the great privileges I've had working over the years has been to interface with so many wonderful partners that have contributed to my efforts to bring Indigenous communities into this forum, and certainly CREST has been a key component. And the things that I talked about in the past about capacity building and have been things that have been known and working for the federal government, which moves very slowly, an ongoing challenge. But in around 2016, we were able to get Senator Schatz. Senator Schatz reached out and we crafted the Native Act. And that's the Native American Native American Tourism and Improving Visitor Experience Act, which they have to have an acronym. But that was really the seminal piece of legislation that then provided the framework for the federal agencies then to look within their existing programs and identify resources that could support tribal capacity building for tourism. And so in my exit years of the at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I was charged with implementing the act and putting things in place for that. And you work through different administrations, you work through different lenses and how people interpret these things. But as a part of that, then we were able to take the message of the act to the larger audience at the Organization of American States and their tourism ministerial, and talk about what was being done in the United States. And out of that conversation back in 2015, we were approached to develop a partnership between the Organization of American States and the Indian Affairs, which is under the U.S. Department of Interior. And so looking at doing that, we had to get the approval of the State Department for the Organization of American States and the administration for my office to work with them. And unbelievably, we were able to get that accomplished under the last administration. And we brought in the George Washington University then as our fiduciary and our kind of the core, because working between these two agencies, being the Department of Interior and the Organization of American States, is very complex. And so we needed that intermediary. Now we have that in place. And so we have an avenue to address some of these issues on a broader scale, looking at Indigenous peoples throughout the Western Hemisphere, but more importantly, to help inform the federal agencies on the needs of Indigenous peoples in a broader context. Sometimes within our own country, we fail to see our tribal communities as being part of this larger Indigenous community, throughout the world, and that our challenges are no different. And so, COVID unveiled a number of things in regard to the lack of infrastructure for Indigenous peoples, and that was certainly found here in the United States. And so when we look at infrastructure for an industry, for tourists to come in, we also have to address the infrastructure for people just on their basic needs. And so now with the Native Act and these efforts, we're able to address some of that. And we now have projects going in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, where we have the tribes within each of those states now forming their own alliances and being able to work back with their state tourism offices and their state economic development offices and be recognized as a part of their work. So, this Native Act and this work is ongoing, but we are seeing great progress in being able to not only have tribes identified as a part of an industry, but now have access to the tools and resources to be effective as a part of that industry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Hall. Both your comments and Dr. Honey's speak to the need for solutions to be cross-sectoral in nature. So private, public, and nonprofit engagement becomes key in making sure that we're able to actually make strides moving towards the desirable sustainability goal that we are all aiming for. So thank you for that. Mr. Takayama, any additions?
Sure. I guess I can reflect to my experiences in Asia. Of course, I have two topics on this one. One is about, of course, greenwashing, but in particular, maybe you also use the icon SDG washing. This is happening really bad in our part of the world. For example, local government would allocate funding and people to erect those solar panels in the mountainside, for example. They are doing it to achieve SDGs like 13, which is for climate action, or 7 for affordable clean energy. But at the same time, because of the the landscape pollution, or it can also trigger landslides and other things, depending on what way they put those pictures. So a lot of the people are really focused on like a silos, in a way that they are not really think about other effects which could be positive or negative. So we are also working with standards for that reason, that we use standards as checklists, so we are not missing out on any important criteria. So GSTC standards really means a lot to us. But if you're talking about standards, you're only talking about like the top runners who can be recognized. But what we need to focus is the people who are not working with the standards, because the majority and the big part of the mass tourism and that are destructive sort of irresponsible tourism are not working with the standard. So these people and destinations and businesses, we really need to work on and combat greenwashing. So that's my, number one. And second is that I think because of China is gaining momentum economically, and of course populous country, India is also I think surpassed China's population now. It's the biggest country in terms of population. So Asia is becoming the source market for tourism. And I think we have been talking about a lot of standards, but they are all created in the West, so to speak. So, for example, just thinking about the culture and the nature, for example, when we talk about World Heritage Site, we need to decide, is it culture or the nature? But I think Ed can agree on this, that if you talk about indigenous people, culture and nature are inseparable, so we cannot say it's black and white. So I think a lot of the community-based, nature-based tourism in particular, I think we cannot overlook the cultural components when you're talking about the responsible tourism. So I think it is being neglected sometimes if only using the Western standards. So I think Asia, it's coming to the time where we also need to create our own standards that makes sense, and for agent by agents. I think that's the latest challenge that's working for us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Takayama. It's interesting that we do want folks to move down the avenue of sustainable tourism, but as you rightfully mentioned, that sometimes folks just latch on to the concept in and of itself, and they don't distill down to what the principles are that represent that concept. But I think something else that is important that you are alerting us to is the fact that as we develop these concepts that we want to be universal in nature, we also want to be attentive to ways in which we empower communities, to use a term that Mr. Hall shared with us earlier, to come up with their own definitions or their own terms of engagement with that concept. I've had the great pleasure of working with Navajo Nation community, a Dene community here in Arizona. And one of the wonderful things that have emerged out of our work together was a 2-year endeavor where they created a definition of what sustainable tourism means to them. They've actually come up with a wheel that entails the key core concepts that draw on their culture to exemplify what sustainability means and how tourism that is sustainable in nature manifests in that context. I think giving communities the power to define how these things, appear within their context is vital, because sometimes what we think is a new concept to a community actually goes back to their origin stories. And so we have to make sure to amplify those local knowledges as we work alongside them to create more sustainable approaches to doing the work that we all have to work on. All right, so at this point, I'd like for us to transition. We've been more reflective in our earlier discussions, and now we want to project forward to speak just a little bit about what the future holds. And this will also be something that our colleague Jonathan Day builds on in tomorrow's World Tourism session that is hosted by CREST. And so this is, excuse me, our last main question from the panel. There'll be other questions, but last a question that we have shared with the panel a priori, and it goes as follows. I've asked the panel to think of themselves in the future and ways in which they can beg, borrow, and steal from the lessons that they've learned from the past and take those forward in the future. So panels asked to think of a letter that they would each write to themselves in the future. And in that letter, they'd have to specify important lessons learned from the last 2 decades and also capitalize on important lessons that we can capitalize on in the future as we create a more responsible tourism industry. So without further ado, if we could begin with Mr. Hall, as you write this letter to your future self, what actions do you think need to be taken by whom to ensure that the lessons that we've learned over the decades are not lost upon us?
Well, thank you. We working with tribal communities, indigenous communities, we look to our elders, and of course, we're taught as indigenous people that we are the product of our ancestors. So, when we speak on behalf of our ancestors who came before us because we're the culmination of their voice. And, as we look forward, the most important thing we have to recognize is youth. The youth are what's forward. And so our ability to instill and convey our core values into our youth and have them see that as relevant to their future is one of the most important things that we can do to ensure that our youth have the ability to carry forward and also evolve our culture in a way that is relevant to current society, but maintains and respects our values and our ancestry. We are our future ancestors. And so we also have to see our actions as being informative to the youth. And so as we look at, what we're doing here, tourism then is an avenue where the world hopefully looks with respect at these indigenous cultures and reinforces that effort with our youth so that we create a tourism environment, a product that gives them the sense of being respected as a culture and a value to carry that forward rather than being a commercial commodity that is something that they wear for something and take off, that isn't relevant to themselves or their future. So it's a fine line, but I hope that we refine our education components and how we develop our internal communications to make sure youth are at the forefront as we move forward and see this as a part of their vision for the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Hall. And if I may, perhaps we could also say that not only do we want them to be at the forefront, but we also want them to be at the decision-making table, because I think there are communities still, unfortunately, in which the youth voice in and of itself has not been valued. So I think, as you rightfully mentioned, ensuring that we see them as a group of citizens that have an important message to convey to us and an important contribution in this sustainability journey that we're all embark on, then we can ensure that we have a future that we all want to reside in. So thank you for that nod to our youth population. All right, moving on to Mr. Takayama. Any comments on this, please?
Sure. Of course, about the future, it really depends on how we react now. It really depends on what we do. We are responsible for the future generations. I guess biodiversity loss and climate change and all the things happening now, and much more risks than what we used to see 20 years ago. But we also saw the beautiful nature, before the coral bleaching, before the glacier melting, and before the seawater, rise, all these things. So we need to really think what we had before. And a lot of the youngsters nowadays, they're wonderful people. However, a lot of times they want to change the current system. I think in Asia in particular, we really have to respect the wisdom of the ancestors, in a way that the modern people want to change the current system so that they believe that they're improving the system. But it's not always the case. Sometimes you end up in contrary. So looking back into not digital information, but also going back further, even deeper to before the digital era. I mean, reading a 20 years old book can be nonsense for some young people, but it is actually a very, very nice book, because we grew up on those books. So we really suggest that going back to before the digital era, there are tons of good information that our ancestors have left for us. And it's talking about the amazing things. So I think we have a lot to learn. So I always talk about the tofu analogy because I'm a Japanese. For example, if you go to in Japan, you can go to a shop and buy fresh tofu. The tofu has not changed over 300 years, for example, right? It has never changed since my childhood. But so the outcome is always the same. However, there are a lot of fluctuation. The temperature, the moisture, all these things are changing always. But the people who are working to deliver the same result is doing a lot more to deliver stable outcome. I think tourism should be like that. We need to retain and preserve what we have now. In order to do that, we have to work hard on the backstage. But the people want to, now they really show off to make a superficial changes that they want to get the credit for. So I think we really have to educate people, in particular the younger people, who can really understand what we have done and spent 20 years or even more life for. So that is my message for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Takayama. I bet you our Japanese ancestors might be infuriated when they see that these days one can get chicken tofu. Now that's a complete alteration what tofu used to be. But I think it also it brings into mind the importance of an intergenerational dialogue on these matters, so that we're not essentializing neither the ancestors nor the youth, but rather ensuring that there's actual dialogue between them to allow for self-reflection, as well as a creation of co-creation of outcomes, so that neither one of the generations is on the decision-making table without the other. So thank you on building on Mr. Hall's components there. Dr. Honey.
Well, thank you. I certainly endorse listening to our ancestors. I'm actually teaching a course now on Native Americans in the Hudson Valley where I live, and I'm having Native tribal members come and speak to the class. I'm organizing it, not teaching it, but I'm learning a tremendous amount. But among the things I've learned is the importance of past generations and of looking to the future, to future generations. That's not what I'm going to talk about now, though, however. What I wanted to talk about was sort of how I saw things in terms of future, what tourism needed to focus on in the future, how I saw things on the eve of the COVID pandemic. Which was in late 2019, when it seemed to me that the two major problems facing the tourism industry at that point were over-tourism and climate change. On the first, over-tourism, before COVID brought the travel industry to a standstill, progress was beginning to be made. Around the world, a number of cities coastal areas, beaches, parks, and World Heritage sites were beginning to develop strategies for how to control tourism. CREST published a book on overtourism in 2021, ironically, right at the height of the pandemic when there was no tourism. And in this book, we analyzed the multiple factors that had created a perfect storm of overtourism. These included the exponential growth of Airbnbs and cruise tourism, the expansion of cheap airlines, proliferation of social media, selfies and bucket lists that were driving tourism in certain to driving over tourism in a number of destinations. In terms of solutions, particularly the US national parks and European cities seem to be developing tools for controlling the numbers and flows of travelers. These included booking ahead and limited numbers of people allowed into key destinations, key attractions, ground rules and limitations for Airbnb, some limitations on the number of cruise passenger debarkations per day in some locations, and promotion of less visited towns and parks as alternatives to the overtourism places. What was clear, a key lesson from these early efforts, was that overtourism had to be addressed in a multifaceted way involving all relevant stakeholders. For instance, in Barcelona, the city developed a master plan for controlling overtourism, which was directed by city officials, but involved businesses, academics, NGOs, civics, and community organizations, as well as the tourism sector. In addition, surprisingly, more lessons emerged during the pandemic itself, as cities, parks, beaches, and other high-volume tourism destinations saw nature recover and life return to a quiet normalcy that places like Venice and Key West had forgotten were possible and desirable. As we emerge from the pandemic, overtourism is also returning, and I feel somewhat hopeful that because of the number of tools already developed in a number of places, we will be able to control tourism. It's not a sure thing, but at least we have some tools to work with. However, on the other major issue confronting tourism, climate change, that remains far more intractable and dangerous. We've only taken baby steps to address it, and climate change will continue to be our most pressing problem, both for tourism and, frankly, for our planet and for all of us on it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Honey, for ending on that note connected to overtourism, which is a phenomenon that I think many nations have dealt with and are attempting to find ways to deal with by involving multiple stakeholders in that solution, in a solution-based approach. It's one of those elements where you have a success story, but too much success in and of itself can be detrimental, particularly if we haven't taken into account the needs of the local community who's hosting the industry in that locale. I want now to transition to some audience questions. We've got some questions from the audience that I think the panel can shed a light on, and so if you bear with me here, I will read a question to the panel and ask for you to respond to it as you see fit. So the first question is as follows from our audience members: when you add up all the good that has been done regarding ecotourism and responsible tourism programs and efforts with what is happening with greenwashing and over-tourism, are you finding yourselves with more inspiration or concern regarding the state of things and the future?
Well, perhaps I could start with a couple of thoughts. I think I have mixed feelings. I think that over the last 20 years or so, we have definitely developed some tools, and we've really added to our knowledge of how to do sustainable tourism, ecotourism right. I think we have the tools in place to do it, but it's the implementation and the enforcement that is not being done well. And the area where I have particular concern is sort of the if we look at the three legs of ecotourism, is the human leg. That is what workers are paid, what the community is gaining, what is the impact of tourism on the human beings involved in running the tourism operations and in the community, particularly in very sensitive indigenous people, native communities that Ed has been working with for so many decades. I think that it has been easier and in some ways a little more popular to address the environmental concerns. And so a lot of eco lodges and tourism businesses have concentrated on that. And in many cases, actually hidden what they're doing for their staff. Are they really paying a living wage? Oftentimes not. What are the working conditions like? How significant are their give back programs to the communities? How much are they hiring locally? All kinds of questions like that are just not being fully addressed. I feel have not been fully addressed as we look at, ecotourism. So I think the positives are that we sort of know how to do it right. We have the tools, but we're not implementing it right. And of the different legs of ecotourism, I think the workforce, the human leg, the community leg is the one that has been neglected most.
Yeah, that's an important point. Any additions from any other panelists on this notion? Are we optimistic or not as we look forward?
Well, I guess I can step into that by saying I'm more optimistic. I guess people can learn from mistakes. That's always has been the case. And including all these things that are happening in relation to global warming, for example, I think we have come to a point where we can no longer take this anymore. So implementation would take place now that more people are dying and perishing, unfortunately. So governments are actually finally not just talking, but actually making implementation. So that is a good sign. And when we were just talking about ecotourism 20 years ago, there are only a few of us in the group. But now everybody is talking about sustainability. It could be greenwashing sometimes, but still they're making steps forward, never met backwards. So I'm pretty optimistic in a way that the tourism can be more responsible. I know that people can get very furious if it's overcrowded and not getting the money and the values that they thought they would get. So I think over time, I think we will get into the saturation point where people would understand and start behaving the way it should be. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I'll go ahead and say a couple things here. I think that when we look at the environment and ecosystems, it's so important to recognize, their sustainability in conjunction with community. When we look at it as a product, and certainly it's a capitalist industry, sometimes we forget about, the value of the environment that people are flocking to and overcrowding. And, adventure travel is another point where we have to be very careful because, the sustainability of a product is so important. And so, to immediately see a remote and pristine area as a place to go to do extreme things is not necessarily in line with, conserving and protecting or respecting what's there to begin with. So I think we do have, as Martha said, the tools and resources. How we apply them, how we work with them, how we educate, but how we educate ourselves and how we use the media at the front end too. Responsibility, I think, is the key. And so to get that integrated into the broad media and product lines that people understand when they put things out there like that, their inspiration isn't necessarily in line with the tenets of how you respect a place.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. We have one last question from our audience members, and it reads as follows. What should tourism look like in 2033? Is there a difference between tourist and traveler? And you could respond to that, but either focusing on just what tourism looks like in 2023 and either engage the last portion or not, depending on how you feel.
Well, I think that one thing that is likely is that there are going to be a lot more controls. You're going to have to reserve ahead of time to go to parks, to go to museums, and so on, plan ahead of time. And that this is going to become sort of a way of life. We're going to get used to it. And the advantage is we know when we get there that it won't be overcrowded, that if we're among the fortunate to get in, then there will be a reasonable number of people there. I do hope in the process that this is done in an equitable way and not simply by raising the price, which means that tourism becomes only affordable to those who have enough means. I think a lottery system, first come, first serve, is much better than raising the price. But I think just this, this is one thing. I guess one of the conundrums that I just really don't know is what's going to happen to the cruise industry. I've done a lot of work on that over the years, as some of you know, and really feel that large cruise tourism is absolutely unsustainable. There isn't a way to green it, to make it sustainable. It needs to reduce its size and the impacts it's having. And I just don't know how that's going to happen. I had been hopeful that, what we saw during COVID would lead to people rethinking cruise tourism, but I'm not sure that's happening. And I think this is a real challenge that both the traveling public and the industry, the tourism industry, is going to face going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Honey. And to your point on equity and inclusivity as something that we want to ensure we have in 2033 and in relation to the cruise industry, the bargaining power or lack thereof that the nations at which the cruises dock is something that one would also have to account for, because they tend to have much leverage. I tell you. Other panelists, Mr. Takayama, Mr. Hall, any thoughts on tourism in 2033?
Okay, sure. I guess flying shame may be different because of the fuel going to be sustainable fuel, and I think that will reduce the people who have been hesitating to fly. But of course, it's not only the fuel, but it's still emitting, or it's still hitting the sky. But I think the impacts will be reduced, and the time element. For example, people after the COVID in particular, they want to explore more, and they want to explore to get away from the what do you call the to detox themselves, so that they are not in reach of the phone reception, for example, or there's no internet. All these places which now I guess like for example, national parks, so people can tag with the GPS location, and people flock to that place, which is not under control of the park manager or anyone, but it creates over tourism really easily. So I think there will be more restrictions and regulations. But at the same time, I'm very concerned about the emergence of drones, people who may be flying all over the place, and the packages could be all over the place, and air traffic and all those controls are going to be a big mess, I think. So those things will be a big change that's coming by 2033, I think.
Wonderful. So more regulations that allow us to better abide by sustainable practices. Thank you for that. Mr. Hall.
Yeah, well, I have to agree, certainly that there will be I'm assuming, a lot more regulation. And but my hope for the future too is that we are more informed as people, to understand and have a level of access to good information on how to be responsible travelers, so that regulation isn't such a horrible thing, that it is, accepted and understood for what purpose it serves, right? And I also hope that in 2033, that Indigenous voices have a stronger role, and that they're able to show their authentic selves as a community in this industry in a way that they feel they're being served by the industry rather than being controlled or used by the industry. So I do have hope for the future, but I do think that how effectively we use the media as a tourism industry, to use it as an educational tool, is going to be key.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. And I love how you've directed us to this area where we tend to think of tourism from a very individualistic perspective. I work, to give an example, I know X number of hours. And so tourism then becomes that outlet at which I get everything with no care about environment, social, and economic means of the community. Whereas what we actually need to move towards is sustainable set of circumstances that most of us are wanting to gear towards. We need to have a more a collective outlook, you know what I mean? One that moves beyond me, myself, and I, to the communities in which we are engaging in travel, to the environments in which we are traveling, and really a more holistic outlook of the interconnectivity between us and the world. And I think that's a really great note for us to end. I want to fervently thank the three of you for orienting us to a very fascinating discussion, one that I think will inspire our audience members to dig deeper if they have not already done so on these various topics. I want to also thank you for the foundational work you've done in your respective areas and advancing us towards more sustainable approaches to tourism. We all stand on shoulders of giants, and I see the three of you as being that, and allowing us to engage in this really intergenerational discussion that needs to take us to the future. So thank you for your time, for your thoughts, and for your willingness to be a part of this. I will now send it back to Wes, who will give us a few remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you so much to all of our esteemed panelists. I just want to echo Christine's thoughts that really the folks on this panel have given so much to this field and are such incredible thought leaders. And we're so thankful not just for how they engaged with our community today, but everything that they continue to give to the field as we all look and strive to make our work better, our impact stronger, and ultimately create better collaborations and a more responsible world for travel and tourism. On that note, I also want to thank everybody that came today. I mean, we had people from, it seems like, all continents, from so many different backgrounds and so many different parts of the tourism sphere, from the private sector to the public to civil society. And, we're just so excited to have so many people here. I do want to make a final thank you as well to Dr. Martha Honey. I don't take lightly that I work for an organization that you gave so much time, energy, passion, love, and effort to, and really appreciate your contributions, not just to CREST, but to the work that continues to be carried out by so many in this space. And thank you for your guidance and leadership. On that note, how can you all stay involved? So a couple of things. First of all, we're going to have a virtual networking session after this. I'll tell you how to do that in just a second, but please stick around for it. This isn't the total end of the day. But we also hope that you can stick around tomorrow. So tomorrow we will have another panel that is titled Tourism in the Next Era, Trends, Challenges, and Opportunities on the Horizon. We'll have a keynote speech from Kimberly Daly, and we have an incredible group of panelists joining us tomorrow as well. And we will also be presenting the Martha Honey Legacy and Responsible Travel Award to this year's winner, and we really hope that all of you can show up, engage us again. You asked some great questions today in the chat, and it was really engaging. So please do join us tomorrow. Just a reminder that the event tomorrow starts at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So an hour from right now, tomorrow, is when that will begin. It's not going to start at 10 a.m. Again, that's 1 p.m. Eastern time, 10 a.m. Pacific, and we really hope to see you all there. So on that note, I just want to say that we are going to now have a virtual networking session, which I'll be joining as well. I did last year. It's really fun. So we hope you can join us for it. What you'll need to do is on the left side of your screen, you'll see a People tab. So right when we finish here, you can hit that People tab. That will allow you to join our networking session, and it will randomly pair you for 3 minutes and 3 minutes only with somebody else. You'll have the opportunity to extend if you'd like, but it'll pair you with somebody for 3 minutes. You can meet them, chat with them quickly, and then you'll be randomly paired with somebody else. That will go on until 1 p.m. if you'd like to join us. Again, a great group of people here. And then finally, to stay engaged with CREST, as you can see on the screen here, please feel free to email us, contact us, and join our mailing list. There's also the option to donate. We are a nonprofit, again, so we depend on support from our community. So if you'd like to donate, give back, any amount helps. Feel free to snap that QR code or go to responsibletravel.org/donate as it shows on the screen there. On that note, we're going to go ahead and head over to our virtual networking session. One last thank you to Holbrook Travel, our incredible sponsor for this event, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you again.